All right, we are back at House Education, 23rd of January, 2025. This is just a time for the committee to talk a bit and kind of unpack from the presentation we had yesterday afternoon, and to kind of try to set a course as to where we, this committee, kind of goes next. I'm going to let the educators in the room here facilitate this discussion since they're better at it than I am. So Representative Brady is going to try to walk us through. I'm going to go up to the whiteboard to use. I happen to like it. I use it for it's really for my benefit, so I can look up and refer to it and so I don't forget things. There'll be better notes taken. But anyway, let me turn it over to you and go right ahead.
I would suggest that we only have 25 minutes in our sort of initial response to just go around and let each person share 3 to 5 sort of questions that you have in the wake of the presentation. There may be way more than that, but if we can limit it, and some of them may get, be repetitive, and I'm going to actually just try to transcribe in this newfangled Google Docs thing here of what all of our questions are, thinking the next step might be then to figure out what are sort of the categories or buckets of work and testimony that we might need to pursue them. So it's putting people on the spot a little bit, and I don't know if some have already kind of generated that and someone wants to start. You certainly don't have to share, but if we could start to get a real sense of all the questions within our committee. And all right, I'm like, Representative Long's ready to go.
Thank you. I'm happy to start. Great. Because it is so broad for me.
Yeah.
And I'll say that I left yesterday with a very open mind on what was put on the table, with a few pretty significant concerns. One was on timeline. Because the proposal came to us with so many details missing, that it feels really daunting to have to fill in those details or wait for more details, which is what we were hearing. So that's one of my biggest concerns. I had hoped we would have a more foundation under us at this point, and I think we don't, which is fine, but just worries me about the timeline. I have questions and deep questions and concerns about much of all of this, but one of the main questions I have, and we talked about a little bit this morning, about the role of the state board and rulemaking being shifted. That's a question I have. I need to understand that. I need to understand how, I think you said 3 to 5, I'll probably end it right here just because I want to allow others.
Yep.
But how much larger districts, catchment districts, can function with mixed delivery, and even our SUs say nothing about districts. Why is that? So how does school choice and vouchers fit into that model? It just is, there's no way to understand what the plan is on that. So many others, but those are some of my first ones.
I think that was a good sort of quick, what is your sort of gut check on it? And then 3 to 5 questions would be great. And if they're repetitive, I think it's helpful for us to know that at this point, to see what are the biggest common themes of questions. Does Kate or Beth want to go, and we'll keep going in a circle, or nope, Jana's ready, so we will go out of order.
Yeah, so I think Emily highlighted a couple. I mean, the timeline obviously is a really big one, probably for all of us. I guess, thinking a little bit more about it, we've heard from nearly every witness who's sat in committee this year about the need to increase capacity in a lot of different areas at the AOE. And so when I look at that huge transformation plan that was proposed yesterday, it's sort of like, what comes first? How can we do this huge, work to transform the system with how AOE is currently operating? So do we need to build capacity there first before we can undertake the rest of this? Or sort of like, who are the people who are going to map out, step A to Z on this plan, I guess, was one of my big questions.
Other?
That was sort of my big one.
Okay. All right, Chris and Kate?
I can basically say ditto to what's been said already. Definitely want to dive deeper into the actual districts and the sizing of the districts. Would love to know a little bit more about the cost savings, maybe versus stabilization, and what we're going to look at for, for that in the future. And when it comes to the foundation fund, I think we're going to have a lot of discussion about allowing excess spending and how we're going to deal with that, butting up against Brigham and other issues.
Yeah.
Great. Kate and then Rob?
I wonder about what does it entail to make some governance changes at the higher levels from an agency of ed to a department of ed. I wonder about, along those same lines, what's involved in changing the makeup of the state school board. I wonder about redistricting and in particularly the busing repercussions of having 5 districts in terms of cost and how long kids are on a bus. And I always worry about when we talk about class size and sort of fitting things into taking the number of students and dividing by a particular number, ending up with part-time staff positions that are difficult to fill.
Rob?
I was, most of that, but also I was wondering if, and I think I read this in the paperwork, that if he's talking about regional type high schools, can this somehow be tied in with construction? If they're thinking about, right, because we have plenty of schools that need major, what's that?
Aid, construction aid?
Or, I guess I don't know how, if so many schools are really like in a bad situation in terms of what they need to have either replaced or refurbished, if we're talking about regional schools, if somehow part of the plan could be, okay, well, we're going to recreate this one, replacing this one, this one, and this one. So because that's been a thing too, right? Construction costs.
Others on your list at all, Rob, or ones that have been repeated that are particularly
Timeline stuff.
salient?
I mean, because honestly, as I was thinking about this, not just in what we've been hearing in the last couple of weeks, but even before I got here, I was thinking there needs to be like a 20-year plan to do this. Right? I mean, I don't know how we get this all done in 2, right? It's a lot. So.
Yep.
Full disclosure, I traveled last night and this morning, so I have not read this in great detail yet. AOE capacity, or all of our capacity. And a constituent this morning at the gym said, well, does it talk about independent schools? So what's the role of how we deal with independent schools? Yeah, if at all.
Yeah.
They don't know.
So again, capacity of AOE for me, like I do see a lot of benefits in this, but I don't know that are they ready to start the implementation. It sounds like from staffing it might not be the case. So what does that look like for them? Even bigger though is the districts and the sizing of them. I actually expected it to be 10 to 12, not 5. So how does that impact local communities' ability to feel like they have a say in how their schools or what their schools provide to them? It starts to feel a little further away from what we're used to as a community. So how do you bridge that gap? Okay.
My questions, some of them surround page 9 of the briefing report that had the ideal numbers with 600 students for high schools and 450 for elementary. So I'm wondering, like, how many schools in some of our most rural areas do you have to put together to reach those numbers? And then I'm also wondering, what is the impact on all of the people in our communities that work as paraeducators, teachers, other jobs? They have like one principal for 600 students. So I think, looking at that, like how many people are going to need to find new jobs, and is that good for the economy if suddenly a whole bunch of people lose their jobs? So that's one question. Another question that I have is, what does bargaining look like in this model? And how are our constituents going to react to this loss of local control? Because this is a lot of loss of local control. So those are my big questions.
Everything's really been said. For me,
Can you, what, the ones that are most pertinent to you, can you just repeat it?
yeah,
I'm just trying to
absolutely.
keep-
The timeline, specifically how quickly or how drawn out it's going to be, I think it's going to be really important because I've already seen some uncertainty in the field from constituents and people that work in schools, and they want to know how exactly this is going to work. So I think communication on our end and communication and openness in our community on these conversations we have is going to be really important because people are going to be looking at this very meticulously and want to make sure we're making the right decisions, and sometimes they're not the easiest ones. So a timeline, where the cost savings are, that's the biggest part for me, and how this benefits students. What's the total benefit for students, and that's going to be at the forefront of everything we talk about. I don't know if that helps Peter weigh anything else up there, but
Peter need to go.
Peter, do you want to share yours, or do you?
Sure.
Neutral observer.
I sort of have been thinking in my mind, what sort of issue can we bite off and start chewing on first? I think that we probably don't know, like, what would it take to deal with drawing new district lines? I mean, what's the legal minefield that's out there? Who does what? So that's a big one for me, is that, I think school construction aid has not been mentioned by the administration. It is clearly a key function here that we need to deal with. There was a line in there that talked about schools that are no longer considered viable financially or academically would be offered the opportunity to merge. I think that what that says is, would be merged. But who has that authority and how is that authority exercised? So there's just a lot here. We are awaiting still from the Agency of Education a lot more detail from Legislative Council to work through and hopefully work from. And if it's not forthcoming in a way that we can use it as a tool to move efficiently, how far back does that set us? Like I said, just redrawing lines to me just seems like an awesome thing to have to take on.
I guess I will go last. My questions are, what is the number? If it's a foundation formula and it's, generous, what are the actual dollars here? And then what's the limits or the mechanisms in terms of going over that? Same question about AOE capacity, but also AOE role. It looks in the plan like essentially the state board goes away, or certainly doesn't have any of the functions they do now. And so what does it mean to have all of that authority in one place? I have the same questions a couple have raised about choice and our kind of bifurcated system. How would that transition into this? What would that mean? Where school construction, the regional high school model, I have come to generally fairly supportive of, but in many places those might not exist or not exist in that configuration. So that's going to be spending money. So how are we collectively gonna commit to potentially spend money to save money? And then number 5 is the timeline as well, but really, I'm gonna try to stay pretty focused and reuse this a lot, but is the impact of implementation in the field, and particularly on kids and teachers. I captured a line from Superintendent Collins yesterday. She was talking about PCB testing, but my intern helped me capture it. So like that really speaks to this whole transformation moment. There's a difference between people who are well-intentioned trying to solve a problem and people who understand on-the-ground reality when those policies and procedures are put into place. And how are we going to respect the on-the-ground people, particularly kids and teachers?
Yep.
Like I said, when we were offline, in schools, we're always building the plane while flying, but now we're talking about like maybe taking it down to the studs while flying. So what is that going to mean, the implementation?
I thought of another one I
Yes.
had and I forgot.
Great, yeah, now we can go back for seconds.
So the overall plan,
Yeah,
our hope is that we're gonna build Vermont's economy, we're gonna change our demographics by attracting families to come here. Is there a plan, or will there be long-range planning that what happens when our student numbers increase? You know, will your school be too small? Because that is really the hope, right?
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
And then,
yeah, and I would love to add to that, and the alternative, which is what if declining enrollment continues to be a trend? There's quite a bit of demographic research that I don't think we can wish away. I think we have to also build a system that's resilient for it. So
Right.
what does all this mean if declining enrollment continues to be a trend?
So
Yeah.
I look at their timeline again, and it's aggressive, but they obviously had to put thought into what their vision of getting to each of these things in this short period of time is. Now we haven't heard yet. Like, what is the story that gets us to the end of 2029, right? And there is one. They can't just. I would assume they don't just put these dates out there arbitrarily and say figure it out. I would think that they have a reasoning for it. So what are their details of their reasoning? Because that could help us understand what some of the moving parts will need to be, better than us just throwing it at the wall.
There's two things I want to just mention. Based on past experience and the work I've done not only on the education committee through Act 46 and locally on my school board, trying to merge to become more efficient, I have found over time that has not been a financial gain. There's typically, maybe occasionally, when you operate under what we consider a more efficient model, there will be some efficiency in the beginning, but that rapidly disappears for whatever the reason is. But that's been my experience. I very much worry that our Vermonters have asked us to lower the cost of education, but I see nothing that's, I'm yet convinced that it will lower the cost of education. And then on the flip side of that, I feel like we have a huge opportunity right now to create an education system in my mind that offers equitable access to a high-quality education for all of our students in Vermont, regardless of where they live or what their life circumstances are. And to me, that's the pinnacle I sit on all the time, making sure that every child in Vermont has an equitable access to high-quality education. And there's a lot in here that we need to know before we can ensure that.
Does it, when you think about it, doesn't it feel like, as you're holding that paper, like, this is gonna cost a lot? I know this is meant to streamline and simplify, but it feels heavy, you start writing stuff on the whiteboard and
I think when the governor and his team are asked about it, we'll probably have a press conference, soon. That'll be a key question. I'm going to say that probably the answer is no. It's not going to save money right away, right? But it
Right away.
will
Right.
hopefully bend the cost curve
Right.
toward the future.
Right.
You know, what we're just gonna have to try to do. This is big. There's, you know, obviously a lot of enthusiasm in the body to take on big changes. This is the opportunity to do it. We're gonna get bogged down in the details, and it's gonna be really hard to swim out of it, and for real reasons. And we're just gonna have to try to just put our heads down and get through it as best we can. The challenge is going to be, you know, we need the administration to, if we're going to use their proposal as a framework, the detail is going to be so important. And, you know, at this moment, that's still a bit of a TBD. As we go to build an agenda for next week, I might suggest, and I'm open to people saying, no, let's not do that, let's do this, because, you know, I'm not really, I'm just trying to tread water here as much as the rest of you. Talking about just redrawing lines. And I think have legislative counsel come in and talk to us about, like, what does that mean legally? What are, you know, where do we start? Who does what? What is that? How does that fall within state statute? And sort of, we often hear, well, you're the legislature, you can do whatever you want. But we'd like to have that confirmed. But you know, we're all at this point starting from a lack of knowledge base, and to build up from there is going to be super hard.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
When we sit in front of ourselves with a map in front of ourselves, we all go to the map. I think what you're suggesting is not looking at a map, but actually talking about this at a higher level, so that we don't get bogged
the
down.
whole statutory legal framework.
Right, I would really welcome that opportunity, because when we start, I know because I remember it before, when you start putting a map in front of you, all you see is your district or your neighboring district or whatever, and you can't, it's very hard to stay away from that. So I really welcome that opportunity to understand what it really means before we ever look at that.
Yeah, I think that's where I would appreciate starting. I think that's one of the big aspects of this whole plan is size and scale, right? So that's going to be a big focus on how this whole proposal moves forward or doesn't really move forward as planned. And for the foundation formula, mostly Ways and Means will mostly be dealing with that kind of aspect, which is another big chunk of it. So I totally think we should start with the districts and the scaling.
Beth, did you hear that? Does that sound like something that you could provide for us? We're not asking you to solve it, but to just sort of say, hey, here are all the questions that need to be answered to even put something like this into play.
Yes, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. Yes, and what you choose to do would then have ripple effects, right?
Right.
That some of it would be GovOpsy type things,
Absolutely, yes.
right?
Yeah.
So as far as elections and literally who's polling places, who's opening those polling places, who's counting the ballots, all of those things. So I think starting big picture, knowing that the decisions you make are gonna cause ripple effects, and I may not be your main resource, I will do my best to get you those resources, yes.
Great. I think for the time being, we'll start off with existing law, what that allows to happen, and maybe a little bit about the sort of the authority of the secretary and the authority of the legislature. Because there's often said that, well, anyway, that would be whatever you can provide. Great. book Beth for every moment she has next week.
I live and die by my calendar, so you book me. I will be here.
Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna add. I think what Beth's saying is really interesting. Like, I would love to know, just try to map out at a really high level exactly like where our work is going to run into elections, collective bargaining, labor.
Yeah.
You know, even yeah.
Yeah, some sort of mapping out. I think is a great way to put it. If we can visualize that, and really those issues that we need to spin off, we need to spin off quickly. Or the things that we have to spin off. Yeah, there's a lot there for everybody, probably. I'll figure out how to get agriculture into it, but.
When you buy the farmland,
They'll be away.
I just, can't emphasize enough, like in all those things, there's no official entity that's those in the field, like the teachers and kids, and so, it's a bit like the philosophy around individuals with disabilities, nothing for us without us, and I am so worried about us being in a situation where schools are metaphorically trying to put down tents and plywood to keep schools open, that we create further crisis in a field that's very fragile. And I'm not saying that means we do nothing. I think there's absolutely a lot of interest, but the voice of how in the field, and perhaps the commission is a great resource on that and a touch point for us. Obviously the associations are, but perhaps even the commission in a different way. Maybe there's a new entity that needs to exist that helps that, so that we are not creating harm in the path.
Wouldn't it also be helpful to folks if we're going to take on just bigger districts as a first topic? I think we should have the secretary come in or somebody from AOE to say, okay, sell it.
Yeah.
Tell us why that is better.
Or be able to answer some of the more detail-oriented questions, yeah.
And to me, that's like, can we get something that talks about the timeline? Because that's probably built into how they want, to me, there's more in this one section than we all know that I think could help inform us on what directions to go that we haven't had, and how do we get that as fast as possible from the AOE.
But you talk about timeline, I'm worried about our timeline. We generally like to adjourn mid-May. That is making it short.
Crossovers the end of March.
Yeah.
What are we doing? What is the Senate doing? What is their agreement on?
What do we do this year? What do we do? Put off to next year? Just bigger. Those things that I also think about. But if I think the appetite out there to do something is voracious,
real,
and so if it means we stay late or come back in the fall, whatever it takes, we're gonna have to figure it out.
How late would be extremely late?
Somebody was recalling Act 60, I think, way back when Act 60 was passed. That was mid-June adjournment.
It's an extra time.
All right, but we'll hold there, reset. Before we move into our next topic area. We are the House Education Committee meeting on January 23rd, 2025. Our next topic follows some testimony that we had yesterday, just essentially finding out the status of the PCB testing program, really getting a sense of where things stand. This is a program, as I discussed yesterday, that's sort of ebbed and flowed as it's a bit of a brave new world, and as needs in the field have increased or decreased, so has the program and its schedule and all of that. So today we've got folks from the state agencies to talk to us a little bit about where things stand today and what the future holds. Thank you. Welcome, and introduce yourselves, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I am Matt Chapman. I am the director of the Waste Management and Prevention Division.
Trish Capolino, the program manager for the Sites Management section.
So let me just I'm going to frame our testimony, and Trish is really the expert in sort of where we are. And this is really a where we're at conversation, not a where we're going conversation. Though I am more than happy to come back and talk with the committee about what the plans are for the future, but that's sort of tied up in the budget, and I need to respect sort of the process and make sure that we wait until after the governor's budget address before we start talking about funding and where things are headed.
Which is, you are previewing us that there will be something in the budget.
I mean, I think it is fair to say that we will be back to talk about the program direction after the governor's budget address. And more than happy to come in and spend as much time as the committee wants to spend in light of your robust agenda that you have.
Careful with that offer.
I'm more than happy to. So I think, listening to the testimony yesterday, I wanted to kind of cover a couple things where I thought that there were areas that the committee had a bunch of questions on. And specifically go back, I think, to the core and heart of why we're here and what the purpose of this program is. This program arose after we saw incredibly high concentrations of PCBs, both in the building and indoor air in Burlington High School. And there was a desire by the Senate, particularly, as the chair noted, but we agreed with it to start looking at whether we had a similar issue in other Vermont schools. And I guess I would encourage the committee, if they want to get into the specifics on the adverse health issues associated with PCBs. Dr. Levine came last year to the committee on January 11th and went through a fairly detailed set of testimony on what the adverse health outcomes were, and I'm sure he'd be more than willing to come back and go over it. If the committee wanted to look at it, they could look at last year's testimony. But to sort of summarize it, PCBs are a known carcinogen, and there are significant non-cancer health outcomes that are associated from your exposure to PCBs. Indoor air is one of the highest exposure pathways for students and teachers in schools where there are PCB-related issues, and that's higher than your other exposure routes through food or other issues. And in fact, we have consultants who work for us who work on a national basis, and some of the concentrations we've seen in air in Vermont schools are higher than PCB Superfund sites at industrial facilities throughout the country. So these concentrations are significant and they're of concern. I think that the other thing, just to note, that the health outcomes, I mean, Dr. Levine went through it, and I'm always very sensitive when health is talking about patient-specific sort of health outcomes, but they have had patients reach out to the Department of Health with medical conditions that are consistent with long-term exposure to PCB. So these are not theoretical sort of adverse outcomes that we're seeing. They're consistent with what has been seen. So I'll pause if there's any questions.
We won't get into the science of the health, but I would say lacking any proof of a connection, everything is theoretical.
Well, I guess I would say in this world, when you're dealing with toxicology, there's never any definitive connections with anything. So we look at correlations, not direct connections. So, and that's how we approach things. I guess the other thing, just to sort of flag, I mean, and to give a great deal of credit to the Agency of Education, they have created an expedited sort of funding reimbursement program over at the Agency of Education. I guess I would encourage anyone who's watching who's had issues with getting reimbursements to reach out to either the Agency of Education Business Office or the Deputy Secretary Grace Campbell. They are doing what they can do to clear obstacles in order to ensure that schools get reimbursed as promptly as possible. So they are our funding delivery mechanism, and they're doing everything they can. And sort of with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Trish and let her sort of give the overview of where we're at with PCBs in schools.
Hi. I actually have a background up to current day, just to catch up some folks that haven't been in this program for a little while, or just to remind you what has happened and what we're doing. So Matt went over a lot of the health impacts so I'm not going to cover that again. But I will point out that PCBs are man-made chemicals, that they are in our environment, that we do find them in a lot of building materials in schools, which is why we're looking for them there. There's a lot of correlation that we like to make around lead paint and asbestos programs that schools have where they can leave these materials in place. The biggest difference is that PCBs are volatile, and so we can't always leave them there. We try our best to encapsulate them when we can. Removal is a better option, and so we look at the best ways to reduce exposure, to keep kids and teachers in school, while we look at the best options to address PCBs. That's the biggest difference between how we can manage asbestos and lead in schools versus PCBs. So PCBs are manufactured by Monsanto, or they were manufactured by Monsanto. They were banned by the EPA in 1979 because of the known health impacts and environmental risks from PCBs. Matt went over some of the PCB health effects. I just want to point out that our goal right now is to try and keep PCBs as low as possible as we can in schools. They are, as Matt said, the highest exposure to students and staff of PCBs right now outside of diet and anything else. So in August of 2020 is when Burlington High School work started. That's when DEC was notified. In 2021 was Act 74, which was an act basically telling the Agency of Natural Resources to sample and identify all the PCBs in schools in Vermont that were built or renovated before 1980. At that point in time, we had a deadline of completing that by July of 2024. That was extended to 2025, and now the deadline is 2027 to complete all that work. There are 324 schools in Vermont that were built or renovated before 1980. We have currently the authority to require these schools to conduct indoor air sampling and address indoor air results if they're above an action level that the Department of Health has derived. Under Act 178, there was $13.5 million that was provided to address assessment and cleanup of all the schools in the state of Vermont, and $16 million was provided to Burlington High School. Currently, we have identified 46 schools that have PCBs and indoor air above our school action levels. I will point out that the school action levels that were derived by the Department of Health range in concentration based on the amount of PCBs that a child can or cannot have in their body. So lower concentrations for smaller children, higher concentrations for children to adults. And it ranges from 30 nanograms per meter cube, which is the pre-K concentration, 60 nanograms kindergarten to 6th grade, and then 100 nanograms for 7 to adults. The concentration in Burlington High School was 6,300 nanograms per meter cubed. There is no question that PCBs are toxic chemicals. There is no question that this is time consuming. There's no question that this is a lot of work for the schools involved in this and the programs that are trying to help the schools. The science on the chemicals is clear. PCBs pose long-lasting health risks to students and staff, and the work in this sampling program helps to reduce and ensure that PCBs can be reduced in Vermont schools. The process that we use to do the PCB sampling right now is DEC's hired a consultant that will go into a school, and they will go into every space in that school from the basement to the attic and identify which building materials in that school have the high likelihood or potential to contain PCBs. And then the consultants will go through and they will group rooms into like and unlike spaces. So they'll look at places that have the same paint, the same windows, the same heating systems, the same spray-on fireproofing, or whatever it is that we're seeing that has a high likelihood to contain PCBs. And then the consultants will go back and sample 30% of the rooms in each one of these groups. So if there's 10 rooms in a group, they go in and they sample 3 rooms within that group. And we use that to give us representative data to say whether or not there are PCBs in those building materials. If the results come back above the school action level, the next phase is to go and identify where those PCB materials are. This is a time-consuming process. Schools are big, and they have a lot of different building materials. We've gotten to a place now where we have a pretty good idea where to look. It's usually caulking and windows, mastics, paints are the highest PCB contaminating products outside of the spray-on fireproofing that we found in multiple schools that has extremely high concentrations of PCBs in them. 102 of the 156 schools that we have tested do not have any impacts above the school action level. So we know about 46 of them that have indoor air results above that. That's 31% of the schools. 20 schools have indoor air results above what we call the immediate action level. And this is a concentration that we say is not safe for students and staff to be in those spaces. And so we try to reduce time or reduce access to those spaces. We've collected over 6,000 indoor air samples, and they've ranged from 1.4 to 3,200 nanograms per meter cubed in all of these schools. We've done cleanups in 7 schools. I need to get my water. Sorry. The other thing happening at schools is kids bring home sicknesses to their moms.
That does end. When the kids get older, it stops.
When they graduate.
Well, even when they're out.
When they leave after college, I think.
Sorry. So we have conducted 6 cleanups at multiple different schools. I just want to point out that I know yesterday Superintendent Collins was talking about costs and everything, and to date, what we've done at North Country has been the most expensive of those costs, and it was a total amount spent of $7.2 million, which includes all the assessment costs. But we've conducted cleanups at Twin Valley Elementary, Bells Falls, Rutland Town Elementary School, Charlotte Central School, North Country, Warren Elementary School, and Oak Grove. And the costs have ranged from the highest being at North Country to the smallest being a $0 cleanup at Warren Elementary School, where we're able to identify PCB light ballasts and have them disposed of.
Could I just clarify that cleanup doesn't necessarily mean cured?
Correct.
Yeah.
So I'll get to that piece next. With most of these schools, the schools where several of them have had exceedances and loss to space, we've focused our priority on those areas that they cannot use. And that's what we've been working on for some of the schools. And then there's some areas that still have exceedances, but not as high as the areas that they've lost access to, that they can continue to use. And that will be the next phase of work. So to date, no schools have closed due to elevated concentrations of PCBs in indoor air. We've definitely worked on a lot of different alternatives to keep kids at school or continue learning in person. And I know you heard from Superintendent Collins yesterday. North Country was our most challenging, but we couldn't have done it without working with a great group of people to try and make sure we could make sure the kids were there and learning. Certainly not ideal, but the best option that we could all come up with. So I just also wanted to point out that when we look at schools like North Country, they are in the 2% portion of the schools that we're working on, so they are the ones that are in the paper, but not the majority of the schools that we have that we're currently working with. So our next steps, we are currently still working on annual monitoring or quarterly monitoring in some of the schools. We are focused on finalizing some cleanup plans. So these plans will be the full picture, not partial cleanup plans. And so we're working to finalize cleanup plans at North Country, Green Mountain Union High School, SOAR, Bells Falls, Twin Valley, and Hartford. We are also working with several schools that have decided to continue to work on their own. We have issued letters to them letting them know that when and if we get additional funding, we can reimburse the costs that they've spent. But we are in a holding pattern right now and not adding new schools to the current list of schools that we're working with.
Meaning you're no longer testing new schools?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. We've worked through about 56% of the schools that are in the list of the all schools built or renovated before 1980. And to date, as far as I know, we've paid back the schools for all the costs that have been spent.
Right. I mean, I guess I would say to our best knowledge, the funds have been encumbered and are eligible for reimbursement. There's always a little bit of time between the invoices coming in and the reimbursement requests being made. So that's always a bit of a challenge. And so we work with AOE to try and smooth out any roughness in that process as best we can.
There was talk yesterday about, I think it was at Hartford that they were waiting for reimbursement still. It sounds to me like that there's a bit of a technical reason for that.
I think
with
so.
Money being moved around.
I think so, and I watched the testimony, immediately reached out to the deputy secretary, and they're aware of it over there, and I think there probably will be communications to see whether we can't identify what the issue is and work through it.
We did reach out, to their business office to see if there's something that was happening because we had also heard and we didn't hear back from their business office.
The track record until that came up has been very, very good, I will say, in terms of getting reimbursement expedited as quickly as possible in the older state bureaucracy.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about the Twin Valley situation and perhaps how it also might apply to other schools as basically when we find the high level of PCBs based on the Vermont Health Department's level, it also triggers the federal Environmental Protection Agency and sort of where Twin Valley is falling into that and where other schools may fall into that.
Sure. I mean, let me sort of provide a little bit of breaking news on that front, which is, credit to our colleagues at EPA Region 1. They've been working very closely with us on this and appreciate both the work that the state of Vermont is doing and also some of the needs for flexibility within the federal regulatory structure. They raised this up to EPA headquarters and just received a response that regions will be provided significant additional flexibility to allow materials to remain in place, provided that risks are appropriately managed. So they've got that sort of policy discretion from headquarters. It literally came down on Friday of last week. EPA is going to send the state the written sort of policy directive from headquarters about their additional flexibility, and we're going to work with them to sort of make sure that what the rules are around that are very clear for schools so that they have a clear understanding of what happens when you leave it in place, what happens, and then obviously it's easier if you can just take it out. Obviously the preference is always taking it out if it's easy.
Well, there may not be an EPA to worry about soon enough anyway. Other questions around the room in the few minutes we have? Just to save me from going on and on.
Just to follow up on that last statement.
Sure.
So when the decision is made to leave it in place, there's still mitigation done to,
there is, right?
So ventilation.
Yeah, it's not a permanent leave in place, that's a.
Right, and I think, this is again, trying to take a realistic approach to how we manage these materials. Part of our goal is, our major goal is to mitigate exposure, right? Like we want to stop children and teachers from being exposed to PCBs in indoor air. And sometimes we can do that by encapsulation, ventilation, and other sorts of methods short of removal of the material, especially when it's structural and difficult to remove. The expectation would be as schools develop capital planning processes that removal process gets incorporated and thought about in that capital planning process. And that would be the logical time when they're doing a substantial renovation or reconstruction of an impacted building, that would be the time to go in and appropriately remove and dispose of the PCB containing material.
If I can just follow, but we heard yesterday that sometimes even those don't work, the paint over didn't lower the number, because maybe there's something else. So, it's not, that doesn't matter. One other question I have though, do we know how many other buildings, like residences, businesses, all of that, do we know how many of those have window caulking that is, or plastics or any other things that are creating this? Do we have any clue?
Based on date of construction, right?
Well, what we've seen
Is that true?
Well, what we've seen is that there's the majority of the products that were being used were for large construction projects. So we didn't see it in a lot of residential. And by we, I mean EPA. I use a lot of data to help inform what we're seeing. So you will see more of it in larger construction projects. So large, like large office buildings and stuff like that. That's cool. But yeah, colleges, I know they've seen a lot in the colleges and Massachusetts.
Institutional buildings.
Prisons where you can't escape it.
There's been some discussion internally and externally about where this funding should fall, the PCB remediation. You know, has there been any discussion on your end about, is this going to continue to be an education fund issue, or is this going to be moved into maybe an appropriate budget where it's not hitting the education fund? Because
So I would love nothing more than to respond to that, but that's one of those areas where I need to wait until after the governor's budget address before we talk about specific funding issues.
Just a quick follow-up to that too. I know that Monsanto has been wrestling the courts at a lot of levels. I wonder if this is one of them.
So I will go ahead and share, right? Like both the state of Vermont and a significant number of school districts have sued Monsanto to
Over the
cover the
PCBs?
costs for this program
Okay,
in
okay,
Vermont,
okay.
right? So that is active litigation to which the state of Vermont and a significant number of school districts are parties.
One of the tensions we have is that we sort of created this awareness. It has led to a lawsuit. And, you know, to what extent does halting the testing affect a lawsuit?
Right.
And, you know, I think that you know, I don't want to sit here and say that the House has been hostile to this program, but I would say that the House has been concerned that there isn't a funding plan behind this program. And it just has nothing to do with the folks in front of us.
Of course.
It's really our inability to come up with that. Any other questions? Thank you very much for coming in, and we'll look forward to part two.
I'm more than happy to be back, and we'll share things, so folks, as soon as we get back to a computer, we'll share them with Annie.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Great.
All right, so we are done. We are due over there at 11:45.
That's what I understand.
Yes.